Thank you. So, the final talk of the morning will be about chickens. As Ors pointed out before, sometimes it's fun to switch fields a little bit, and as a biology major, I wanted to study something close to biology, but not quite sitting in a lab. And I found a wonderful public health professor by the name of Jessica Liebler who helped me with this study, and it proved both valuable and incredibly interesting, and I hope starting to pioneer a somewhat niche field within public health research. So, chickens. A little bit of history of urban agriculture and what I'll term backyard poultry ownership. Pre-industrial cities, for much of human history, needed nearby access to food. So, people would have little gardens in their cities, or there would be farms nearby, and animals and livestock within an urban environment. And for a very long time, this is how cities existed. However, with the invention of food preservation and efficient long-distance transit, it essentially eliminated the true need for close access to food and close access to livestock. So cities slowly started to disinvest in local agriculture and local livestock to the point where most cities by the industrial era no longer had nearby food access. However, recently there's been a large increase in interest in local food through environmental movements. And so now you have this uptick in people who wish to have urban gardens, urban livestock, and closer access to their food sources. However, with local livestock, especially chickens, there come risks. And in some of the previous literature reviews and studies that I've conducted, it's been clearly shown that nearby access to live birds increases incidence of salmonella infections, E. coli infections, and Campylobacter infections. And these are all diseases of the avian gut system. So birds poop, you get too close to the poop, or you step in it, or it gets on something and you don't see it, and then you get sick. And this is a common problem. It's been studied in a lot of Asian and Middle Eastern countries, but not necessarily studied in the United States. And disease can be spread through improper sanitation and contact with birds. So the study itself was split into two separate projects, which were later combined to form our final results. The methods of the first project included informal interviews with Boston city officials at the BRA, the Boston Redevelopment Authority, local activists, and bird owners. These informal interviews proved incredibly valuable, and one of my sources I still remain in contact with because she's just very valuable for information about birds in general. I conducted 4 separate literature reviews spanning the topics of avian diseases in general, live bird markets, which would be places where you could walk around and pick out a bird, take it back with you alive, or have it slaughtered and take the meat back with you. There are a couple that exist in the Boston area. And then backyard poultry ownership in Asia and the Middle East. And finally, I conducted an in-depth policy review of Boston. This review took the information I gained from informal interviews and paired it with reading of the city's municipal codes to form a view of how Boston is laid out in terms of its regulations for backyard poultry ownership. So, the results of that first study. Boston is very complex. As fellow KHC student Will might tell you, it's incredibly complicated, and the laws that govern the city are sometimes incredibly nonsensical. In this case, that is completely the truth. The city is divided into almost 500 sub-neighborhoods, and each neighborhood can determine whether or not they want people to own chickens in their neighborhood. So the city has relatively little control over how this works, and that poses, as I'll show later, a very large problem for public health and public safety. There's no common law that covers the whole city in terms of livestock ownership. And in addition, since there's so little research done on this in the United States, nobody looks at this from a public health perspective. The second project was an expansion of the first to the United States. Continental, I didn't include Hawaii or Alaska simply because I didn't include Hawaii or Alaska. I conducted a national overview of laws and ordinances pertaining to urban backyard poultry ownership. I didn't consider rural or suburban areas because I wanted to compare a lot of these cities to Boston specifically. I conducted formal, informal phone interviews with city officials across the country, from Philadelphia to San Francisco. If I needed some information that I couldn't find in the municipal code of that city, I called officials. I spent well over 100 hours just reading legal codes to try and find these little bits of information that might point me to how people own chickens in various cities. I also conducted further literature reviews in legal journals and anthropological journals to try and see if any other fields besides public health had ever studied this phenomenon. And as it turns out, they have. It's relatively small, but there have been other papers published. So some results from that second project. The laws are extremely varied by city. There doesn't seem to be a terrible consensus by region. Cities in the South don't all agree with each other. Cities in the Northeast don't all agree with each other. And it creates a situation that has relatively little oversight and is more complex than I think it should be. There's relatively little public health consultation. Most cities, while the laws may be governed by their public health departments or health and human services departments, upon contacting those people, they really didn't even have any information about the laws that they helped create, which is kind of scary. However, local urban ag groups often lobby city governments to change these laws. So if a city has a high incidence of chicken owners, sometimes they'll lobby the city governments to help change the laws to make them more transparent and more clear. And as I'll show you in a moment, that has very large, or can have very large, public health consequences. And from all the cities I looked at, Boston was the most complex, and it made the least sense in terms of its legal code. So this is a small version of a large table I created. I'm sorry the font is so small, I couldn't really figure out a way to make this too much clearer. So these are 11 cities on the East Coast specifically. The green labels indicate cities where poultry ownership is allowed and there's no maximum limit on birds. Yellow indicates cities where it's allowed, but there is a maximum, and red indicates the only two cities, major cities on the East Coast that I could find that specifically outlawed bird ownership, chicken ownership. Most cities disallow roosters, although some have question marks because their legal codes are so vague. And interestingly enough, only Baltimore included veterinary specifications where you had to take your chicken to a vet if it was sick, and there were certain other veterinary practices you had to abide by if you wanted to own chickens. Because of that, Baltimore and Newark, New Jersey, surprisingly, formed the two exemplar cities that I found in the United States. Their legal codes are the most clear and the most specific. They implement a permitting and registration process so that you can keep track of birds. The city knows who owns birds and where they live, which is very important. And there's a reasonable restriction on number of birds you can own and veterinary specifications. So all of this ties together into several conclusions. The first conclusion being that backyard poultry ownership is an understudied field from a public health perspective. While some legal scholars have delved into the issue and some anthropological scholars have dug into the issue, public health isn't terribly concerned with this in the United States, and it should be. Because chickens are such a large possible source of disease, obviously close contact with humans might pose problems. Local governments don't often enough take into account public health perspectives in determining, this is called animal husbandry from a specific point of view. They don't often take public health perspectives into account. And what this means is that you craft laws and you craft ordinances that don't properly allow for public safety and possible disease monitoring. The biggest conclusion of this is that my faculty mentor and I would like to draft some sort of secondary paper specifically making a policy recommendation to any city that wishes to allow the keeping of birds. These include two things. The first being a standardized permitting process. If you can keep track of where birds are located and where owners are located, you can properly track disease outbreaks. The second being coop and sanitation regulations. I think it's important that cities restrict coops to certain materials that can be easily sanitized and washed, and that the coops are specifically made to be portable so that you can properly sanitize your yard after your chickens have been running around. The third legal recommendation that we would like to make is that there are specific veterinary practices that must be abided by in order to obtain a permit. We don't want to make it scary to obtain permits. We want people to be able to own birds if they so choose, just like people can own most other types of animals. However, because birds are such a large possible source of infection, we feel it necessary to recommend that people get all possible vaccines and injections for their birds, but most importantly, take their birds to the vet if the birds are suspected to be sick. Baltimore was the only city I found in the entire United States that had any kind of legal recommendation of that sort. And from a public health perspective, we think that it's very important that cities craft legal documentation that makes these things clear. There are several futures for this project. It will keep going after I graduate. There's actually a fellow KHCer in the third year, Molly Tobin, who might be working on this, which is exciting for me. We're currently working on a manuscript to be submitted to the American Journal of Public Health by the end of next month. My sections are almost finished up, but we just have to do some spot edits and fill in a couple gaps. The next project is a sampling for contamination of coops and homes of owners for Salmonella and E. coli. Obviously, we need IRB approval for that, and we need a lab to help run our tests. But we think that actually having hard data on how these bacteria are actually spread within people's homes that own birds would go a long way towards proving our point. And then the third one, which I already talked about, was crafting a possible regulatory framework to hand to cities to say, here's, from a public health perspective, what we think you should do. So a couple of acknowledgments besides this cute little bird. Professor Jessica Liebler, who unfortunately is not here. She just got back from a trip to Nicaragua for a different project. Obviously, the Kilachon Honors College for professors and administration who helped me along the way. The Boston University School of Public Health and the Department of Epidemiology. I consulted with several other professors who helped with the project. The Boston Redevelopment Authority, and this activist named Christy Smith, who helped provide a lot of information towards my project. There are some sources, and that's it. So, questions?
I noticed that New York City was a green city. Just out of curiosity, were the laws differentiated by borough, or was it just all the boroughs?
So the question was if laws in New York City are differentiated by borough. From what I found, they were and weren't. The entirety of New York City operates under one legal code, so there's a standardized set of laws, and they're pretty uniform. However, certain neighborhoods, I think Brooklyn was an example, have a slightly different set of regulations, and that's allowed under the city zoning laws, but they're not terribly different.
Could you own a chicken in Manhattan?
Yes. As long as you have the proper space specified in the legal code, you can own birds in a rooftop garden or in the backyard of a row home if you have room.
So you mentioned a few times that birds was a really large kind of potential source of disease, so that the public health departments aren't taking into account. I was kind of assuming it's maybe because they just see it as potential. Is there any way, like any recent outbreaks of disease that you could link back to birds to kind of driving your point, or is that something that just hasn't been studied, hasn't been tracked well? So
it's interesting. It's been studied a lot in Asia. The recent outbreaks of avian influenza were a big problem, and they were studied extensively from a backyard ownership viewpoint. But in the United States, the phenomenon isn't well recognized enough, I don't think. And I think that's the largest reason. One thing we think might be occurring is that certain foodborne illnesses like salmonella, outbreaks occur fairly frequently. It's just a matter of being aware of them. And we think that some of them might be caused by backyard birds that just are underreported or aren't tracked. And so people just attribute it to, they ate undercooked meat or something like that, whereas it very well might have been their neighbor owns chickens. So I think it would be much more interesting to study, and that's why we want to do that follow-up, to get hard data on if those bacteria are found within people's homes. All right, thank you very much.